In the 2010s, action roguelikes exploded onto the indie scene, and games like Binding of Isaac, Risk of Rain 1 and 2, and Dead Cells were, and as a testament to the longevity of this genre, still are huge. But personally, I've always been at arm's length from action roguelikes, only occasionally enjoying them and often getting irritated by some of the more minor flaws in the games. Last decade, Supergiant Games also burst onto the scene and established themselves as a highly talented developer, making some stunning-looking games with solid gameplay like Bastion and Transistor. Yet again, though, I wasn't particularly interested in their catalog. I had enjoyed Bastion prior, but for some reason I really couldn't get into Transistor, and I didn't really find myself revisiting Bastion much. So why, considering these two factors, have I been having so much fun with Hades, an action roguelike made in the direct mechanical and stylistic lineage of Bastion and Transistor, with all of the trappings of other action roguelikes that I couldn't get into? Perhaps it's that addictive RNG and what it facilitates, the crunch of attacks, the glee of a legendary boon, the high damage numbers and melting HP bars. It's all very clean. But the thing is, these are traits that a lot of action roguelikes, and Hades' direct predecessors, Transistor and Bastion, share. The difference with Hades, though, is that because of Bastion and Transistor, Supergiant Games have a lot of experience, and a great foundation for building an interesting, engaging roguelike, which draws on and delivers on the design ideas in Bastion and Transistor better than those games could. Now, to establish how Hades has such a solid mechanical foundation, we have to start with Bastion. Bastion is an ARPG, but one point of difference between it and other ARPGs is how rather than focus on the statistical upgrades that have come to pervade modern gaming, the game provides the player primarily with increased options. You do level up in Bastion, but what really constitutes progression is the amount of stuff you unlock over the course of your first playthrough. For a game of its relatively short length, you unlock a surprising amount of weapons, tonics, and general upgrades over the course of the game, and I think that the skeleton of Bastion's upgrade systems and combat is great. You learn how to use this vast arsenal of weapons, and then you get to New Game Plus, and you'll be able to play with all of the weapons and skills in the game with a modified progression curve to finish off your statistical upgrades and explore the possibilities of multiple loadouts. And a game that's rewarding to play in New Game Plus seems to be what Supergiant Games were aiming for with the difficulty-altering options the game offers. But while I did enjoy Bastion on my most recent playthroughs, and while the exploratory philosophy behind some of Bastion's game design is great, there's a notable lack of polish, which makes all of this stuff a lot less interesting and satisfying than it should be, particularly with how combat actually plays. To begin with, there are a whole bunch of niggling mechanical issues which really start to grate on you when you play this game. The animation is lacking. The machete is boring. Thrown weapons and projectiles are just moving PNGs with terrible range indicators, and the sound design and game feel is all just a bit off. This is all fine by itself, but when this weak animation is applied elsewhere, it becomes a legitimate problem, because a lot of enemies in this game don't really animate when they attack. Now, animating good attack animations for every weapon and telegraphs for every enemy in the game isn't easy, or cheap for that matter, and I can understand why the animation is lacking. But the lack of polish nonetheless makes the basic acts of parrying, dodging, and weaving in attacks feel a lot worse than it should, a fact made worse by how lackluster some of the actual balance is. While some weapons, such as the musket, are very satisfying and novel, a lot of the other weapons are unsatisfying with bizarre overlap in their utility. Having two rapid-fire pistol weapons feels redundant. Some special attacks, such as the grenade, have no indicators. And I know I mentioned it before, but god, the machete just feels terrible to use. Trying to hit a moving target with it is a nightmare. The RPG systems also feel pretty half-baked. You can upgrade your weapons, but a lot of the weapon upgrades just add critical hit chance or similarly uninteresting, purely DPS-based bonuses. The spirits are also pretty unbalanced and lopsided in terms of what they do, and the way everything is presented is rather unclear sometimes. Plus 10 max health. I don't know how much health I have in the menu, so I have no idea how effective this spirit is. It's a shame, because I think the ideas behind the gameplay here could have made Bastion endlessly replayable, but the individual elements are far too shallow for me to be interested in a second playthrough. It also feels like Bastion tries to use its story to motivate players to play a second time, but similar problems to the gameplay apply here too. While there's a significant amount of ambiguity in Bastion, a lot of the ambiguity concerning important plot events such as the Calamity is rather satisfyingly revealed by the end of the game, and the ambiguity that remains seems less to be obfuscated lore, a la something like Dark Souls, and more like a lack of lore. We don't know what goes on in the rest of Bastion's world, even though it feels like we should. And personally, I feel like the lack of real context for the game's events somewhat cheapens the ending of the game and the setting in general. Overall, I'm being highly critical of Bastion here, but I cannot overstate the fact that the game is more than the sum of its parts. The game was a critical darling when it was released, and I don't disagree with that at all. It's just that when you focus on its individual components, particularly in terms of its gameplay, it seems to me like Supergiant Games weren't able to achieve the highly replayable sandbox with an interesting narrative that they seemingly aimed for. Now with Transistor, it feels like Supergiant Games picked up on how shallow and skeletal some aspects of Bastion were, and decided to make them deep. Much, much deeper. No more relatively simple stories of magical MacGuffins, a calamity, and some warlike circumstances. Now we're dealing with uncertain metaphysics and technology, and a story where we're picking up the pieces and trying to understand the motivations of our silent player character, and mostly absent supporting characters. No more redundant weapons with boring weapon upgrades either. Transistor's gameplay has an ocean of depth compared to Bastion. 16 different, distinct functions which can be equipped as active skills, active skill modifiers, or passives. More diverse and interesting enemy design, the turn mechanic, and even a more well-rounded visual presentation without the inconsistencies in map design and animation that Bastion had. Needless to say, while it's not a direct sequel, Transistor is an amazing follow-up to Bastion in how it fleshes out Bastion's ideas and creates a highly compelling playground of a game. Where I quickly grew tired of New Game Plus and Bastion, Transistor motivated me to actually play New Game Plus, and I found it quite fun experimenting with all of the different loadouts and witnessing many of the story events with newfound understanding. But while Transistor delivers on the scope and depth Bastion was aiming for, there are still some issues, and it feels as if its mechanics would be well suited in another context. The amount of interesting synergies you can achieve with Transistor's function system is insane, but once you figure out how OP it is to stack up damage multipliers and cull, or load, it becomes the kind of game where you have to make your own fun, and be creative in order to continue enjoying the degree of customization you have. The real self-imposed difficulty in Transistor isn't achieved through the limiters, but through intentionally choosing builds that aren't overpowered, but not too underpowered. Furthermore, having to go through the same linear levels, and particularly the later story segments, which don't benefit that much from a second playthrough, can also get in the way of those who just want to keep experimenting with the gameplay system. Transistor certainly isn't perfect, considering some of its balance issues and some slightly disappointing design decisions. But the overall package is stunning, and I'm convinced that I was legally insane at the point I decided that I simply couldn't get into Transistor. Still, it feels like some of Transistor's mechanics are almost too good just to be contained in this one game. over the course of a campaign that spans no more than a few hours. It makes you wonder what kind of genre Transistor's interesting synergies, diverse loadouts, and difficulty-enhancing mechanics would be good in. Well, turns out the action roguelike, or roguelite, genre fits perfectly, and Hades thus makes great use of everything Supergiant Games has established. The weapon selection before a run evokes Bastion, and the game's upgrade system, based around boons, evokes Transistor while providing more intrigue than many other action roguelikes. You see, in other similar item-stacking roguelikes such as Risk of Rain and Binding of Isaac, a good run barely even has a specific build or playstyle. The lack of agency and lack of mutual exclusivity with items means that you just get everything. And that's not necessarily a slight against those games, but Hades forces you to specialize and actually create a build. You can't get every god's boons. Different weapons have different ideal build paths, and you can only have one boon directly changing each part of your moveset too. Combine this with the agency to choose one of 3 options with every boon pickup, and there's a lot of variety between different successful runs. I mean, look at this build. I use this particular shield, which has a constantly ticking DPS special, and I end up getting a power shot weapon upgrade which makes my charged attack deal much more damage if I time it right. Combine this with a weapon upgrade which makes this bull rush into a bull shot, crit on my bull shot, and constant lightning procs on my special attack, and I am now a burst damage sniper doing huge lightning DPS while blocking and attacking. Considering some other builds I've gotten, such as nuclear bow builds where this happens,
time to deal with Father's pest problem, I guess.
It seems safe to say that the level of theory crafting here is easily on par with Transistor, and it's in a game with perfect game feel and solid mechanics too. Fair bullet patterns, well-telegraphed attacks, and balanced defensive options. Hades even weaves its narrative and characters into the roguelite formula beautifully. Every run is canonically one of Zagreus' escape attempts, tying into an overarching, light-hearted narrative as characters enter and leave the game's hub, remember what happened in previous runs, and develop relationships. The decision to implement an affinity system into a roguelite seemed rather bizarre to me at first, but damn it, it works, and Hades forces players to engage with its story and enjoy it. Hades encapsulates the best of action roguelikes and Supergiant Games' catalog. It's a fresh, incredibly polished game in which the strengths of Bastion and Transistor shine like never before. And because of that, it's perhaps the most fun roguelike I've ever played.